what the internet has really done is help us separate the notion of content from the notion of presentation, or what we call an artifact. Content is your core idea, the message you want to get across. Artifact is just how you get that across. We have a tendency to look at a web page in a browser and say that's content. That's not content. That's a web page. It's made from content.
Welcome, everyone, to the TechGuide podcast, where we give actual advice to those that are wanting to break into tech or are looking for their next gig. We have Deane Barker, a global director of content management at Optimizely, on the podcast today to talk about content. Welcome, Deane. So excited to talk about your background. You have such a great background, so thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
I want to go back to college days because I think you have a very interesting story. You planned to attend law school, but then you became a beta tester of the original Microsoft network in 1996. What does that mean? You got free dial-up internet connection, which is huge back then. How did you get on this free trial from Microsoft, and what has that meant for like a major pivot in your career?
Yeah, I graduated high school in 89, then I joined the Navy. And so I started college in 93, and about 95, the internet happened, right? 95, suddenly it was like kind of a big deal. And so I went and bought a computer, and I paid $2,800 for a Gateway 2000, 90 megahertz Pentium computers, huge tower thing. And I got online, and the reason I got online is because Microsoft had an icon on the desktop of Windows, and I didn't know what I was doing, so I clicked it. And then it told me I had to plug my phone line into the back of the computer. I didn't realize I'd do that. So I did that, and I got online. And I went on a Microsoft network, and this was 95. I've been a huge James Bond fan my entire life. And in 1995, James Bond had been out of the theaters for about 6 years. He was coming back with GoldenEye, and I wanted to talk to people about James Bond. So I went out to the Microsoft network, and they had a movie forum. And I said, could we have like a discussion group just for James Bond? And the guy said, now famous words, he said, sure, would you run it for me? Would you be the moderator? So I became the moderator of the world of James Bond on the Microsoft network. That was my first gig on the internet. And in exchange for that, I got a free dial-up connection. I ended up getting paid a little bit down the road, but like that's when I just kind of fell in love with it. And I just realized it was never going to go, but the world was never going to go back to the way it was. And I was a junior in college then, and I was majoring in political science and philosophy, headed to law school. And then I realized after college, my greatest skill was inventing reasons not to take the law school admissions test. And I kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. And that was it. And then I went to work in corporate IT. I got a job in corporate IT. I was one of the few people that knew HTML. Yeah. So I got a job in corporate IT building the help system for a phone center, which was really just a lot of manual HTML work. I've been in tech ever since. I did graduate. I have a degree in political science and philosophy, which I certainly don't regret, but doesn't really apply to what I do today.
Yeah, I honestly wish if I had a time machine, I think I would go back to around like that 1995 time and like know what the world was like before the internet and know like what the world was after the internet. Because for you, like you were right there like at the beginnings of it. So I'm sure it's crazy to reflect on like what the world was like before the internet.
Yeah, it's weird because I don't think any college there's no curriculum that could have prepared me for what I ended up doing, especially not back then. I mean, we were making up things as we went along back then. We did things on the internet just because nobody told us we shouldn't be able to do them, right? Yeah. We're making things up. So there was no degree that would have, I think, helped me in my career.
Interesting.
I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, the right generation, and the internet sort of happened when I was entering the professional world. And I'm just lucky in that respect.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that it's like your career in content, you now have been in it for like 25 plus years. Like it started from a James Bond forum where like you just wanted to collaborate with people about James Bond. What type of like content was it just like a community of people like talking about like the movies and stuff, or like what was in this forum?
So that's what it started, people talking, just a discussion forum. But I suddenly got enamored by the idea of self-publishing, that we could think things up and communicate them across the internet to people that we had never seen before. And I remember building a website. It was a James Bond frequently asked questions list, and putting a count. Probably don't remember these, but we used to have web counters, and there were little scripts that would display at the bottom of a page how many people had visited the page. And in the early days of the internet, these were huge. And I remember putting a web counter on there, then putting a link in a discussion forage, and going back later that day, and like 16 people had viewed the page. And it just blew my mind. Like 16 people, and I didn't know these people. Like I thought, like, should I introduce myself? Like, where would I find these people? Like, who are you, and why did you come here? And I was just stunned by that. And I don't know if it was just like narcissism, but suddenly I realized I could create content and people would come and look at it. And that's when I fell in love with content. That's when I fell in love with managing and delivering content. And it just became amazing to me that the world got so much smaller and everybody could suddenly, I could write something about harvesting or growing crops in a certain way, and a farmer in Botswana could read it the same day. And that I found that amazing.
Yeah. And I that's what I was going to comment on. Like those 16 people that like visited your website. It's not like, oh, like I'm going to ask them to do like go to coffee. It's like, oh, these people could be all the way around the world just interested in James Bond. I think that connection would be like so special to be there for that moment.
It made the world so much smaller. And I think kids, I'm going to use the word kids pejoratively, but like kids these days don't understand what it was like not to have instant access to anything you wanted to know about. They don't understand that. Like if you wanted to find something out, you have to like go to the library and find an encyclopedia and look it up. And if you wanted somebody's phone number, you had to go into the phone book. And if you wanted to watch a TV show or hear a song, you had to wait for it to come around.
Yeah.
And it just, the idea that we have so much access to on-demand content, there's a generation that have grown up with us and don't know anything else. But I mean, for people in my generation, it's wild.
Yeah. And that's how you get over 1,300 books in your little library that you have behind you is a lot of reading.
Yeah. I still love physical books. I've been a book lover my entire life. And in fact, I do occasionally read ebooks, but I prefer physical books, and I'll probably never let that go.
I am the same way. There's something very special about a physical book, just having that touch and flipping the page that cannot be beat compared to like a Kindle.
So I maintain that a book is really a trophy of knowledge. And if you think about this is going to be cliche, but if you think about a hunter sitting in their den with all the like heads of the animals they've killed on the walls, this is my den. These are the heads of the animals that I have killed. I have slain all these books. And so books are a trophy of knowledge. And I sit here and I look at these books and I think, I read all those books. And that makes me happy. And that may make me a narcissist. I don't know. I don't care.
Hey, that's why I have a much smaller bookshelf here, but I have more out in my living room, I promise. But it is a trophy case for the knowledge. But
absolutely.
I want to make a pivot now to our content. You've kind of alluded it to talking about content. But content management, you're the global director of content management at Optimally. I am not saying that right. I cannot pronounce that. But let's talk about content and like how it's changed since those early 2000s into what we have today now. We are flooded with podcasts, ebooks, white papers, social media, TikTok, all these different things. But can you kind of talk to me like about how content has really changed since like the early 2000s to what we are now? What makes content great?
Content used to be a really controlled medium. I mean, when you think about a book, right, you lay out a book, you can control exactly how it's laid out, the different margins, you know, the picture over here, and lay it out the same way. And then when the web started, it was still somewhat controlled. Yeah. In the sense that there was just kind of one channel people were viewing it over the web. But I remember when suddenly I looked at a web page that I knew on somebody else's computer and they had a different screen resolution, and so it looked different. And I was like, oh, crap. I can control how they see this thing. And that gave, back in the day, that gave rise to platforms like Adobe Flash, where people loved that because you could absolutely tightly control how something looked, and it looked the same on every single device. And so what the evolution of content of the internet really required us to do was let go of the presentation of it and just concentrate on the core experience of the content. If we're writing something, like concentrate on the words, because you don't know how those words are going to come out. For years, we had the kind of browser wars where different browsers would render things different ways. And then the growth of computer monitors, we had different resolutions. You would design for 800 by 600, then you'd design for like 1024 by 780. And then suddenly people need bigger and bigger monitors. And then we had device proliferation. Then suddenly, I remember I worked at Best Buy in the early 2000s. I was saving money for my wedding. And I had a part-time job at Best Buy, and web TV came out. Suddenly people could surf the web on their television. Well, it looked entirely different. Yeah. And as a web developer at that time, suddenly we had to concentrate on all these different platforms to come out of it. And then the iPhone came out in 2007, and suddenly people are looking at these on small screens, and then tablets came out, and now watches have come out. And what the internet has really done is help us separate the notion of content from the notion of presentation, or what we call an artifact. Content is your core idea, the message you want to get across. Artifact is just how you get that across. We have a tendency to look at a web page in a browser and say that's content. That's not content. That's a web page. It's made from content. You could take that same content and turn it into an email, or turn it into a social media update, or turn it into a PDF, or put it on a billboard on I-90. It's the separation of content. And this goes back to philosophers. Plato talked about logos versus lexis. Logos is the content of a speech. Lexis is the tone of voice and the volume you use to communicate it. And this goes back to the eternal idea that the content that we communicate and the way we communicate it are really, really two different things.
Yeah, I feel like that how you communicate that is like a really big challenge, like within the role. But yeah, can you talk about like what are some of the challenges when you are, is it communicating, or like when you are developing content, like what are some of the challenges that come with it for someone in this profession?
Yeah, the biggest challenge with content is just knowing your audience, knowing who the content is directed to. And you have to get that right. If you get that wrong, you get in a lot of trouble. I do a lot of public speaking, and the biggest mistake you can make in public speaking is the content of your talk does not match the people in the audience. Like you're talking at different altitudes. And I still have this problem professionally as well. Say, just earlier today, I was working on an analyst report with my boss, and we just determined we were talking at utterly different altitudes. I was way lower into the weeds, and he was like at 50,000 feet, and we were just at different altitudes. So the number one thing of content is to get the altitude right, get to the right place. And then the second biggest thing is to figure out, like, what is that person's task? What are they trying to accomplish by consuming the content? Do they have a task they want to accomplish? Do they want to learn how to change the oil in their car? Do they want to just be entertained for a while? Do they need directions to a gas station? So matching tone, audience, task, that's really the key to good content.
Yeah, I want to talk about that last point too. So it's like really starting when you are developing a piece of content, if you're writing it, if you're doing a podcast, any of that stuff, it's what is the end goal in mind of like, what do you want people to get out of when they are done consuming this?
Yeah, so it's like, what is their end state? Like, what is the end state that they want to be in? If I have a flat tire, what did I learn the other day? I stripped the head of a screw. I was screwing something. I was screwing in. Actually, I bought my desk that I'm sitting at. I bought a tray to go in there, and I was installing the tray, and I stripped the head of a screw, which for some reason I do all the time. I don't know if it's just me. And I was finally like, you know what? I'm going to fix this. I couldn't get the screw out anymore because the head was stripped. And so I went and I found a YouTube video, and he showed me neatest trick. You take a rubber band and you put it up against the head of the screw, and then a flat rubber band. And then you push the drill into the rubber band, and by pushing on the rubber band, it gives us enough traction to turn the screw. It worked like a charm, right? It was amazing.
What?
And that was my end state. I didn't care how I got there. I just wanted the screw out of the wood. That was my end state. And so by concentrating the end state they want to get to, that helps you kind of define what that content should be. And this was a lovely YouTube video. It was this old guy, and it was like a 3-minute YouTube video. And I think the guy was like retired, and he just loved like sharing knowledge, and it just warmed my heart and it worked perfectly the first time. It was great. But he understood the end state, and he gave like 3 different ways. And they went from the low-tech way of using a rubber band all the way up to like getting a tool and die kit and like drilling the thing out, rethreading it or something. And it was just beautifully done because he understood the end state that the watch wanted to get to. And he provided multiple options to get there. And it was like the sweetest thing. I want to like find the guy and give him a hug.
Dude, I actually love that. And I think what's also important to like when you are creating content is like, what medium are you making it in? Kind of like the artifact that you're talking about. Like, would this be best be like a video or like a blog? I feel like that's like another really important challenge to keep in mind when you are developing this like content in general.
And it depends what you're doing. Like this particular situation was great as a video. I normally... For sure. Video is not applicable to everything, certainly, but this was a very visual thing. Like if someone had tried to explain to me what to do with that rubber band, like I just tried to explain to you, probably wouldn't have worked that well. Yeah. But this was a great medium. So picking the medium is very, very valuable. Does it need to be a synchronous medium like video? Like I'm watching this thing second by second, or an asynchronous medium like a slide deck, or like, there's so many different ways to communicate content. There's so many different aspects and different faucets to how content gets across that we just have this incredible array of options in front of us today.
Yeah. And I want to talk about like the most powerful ways to make content. If someone's like younger in their career and like, Deane, like, come on, like spill the beans. Like what's some of the best content you've made? What have been the best assets? Like, what do you see that works that I can use in my career? Like what would be your answer to that? Like one of the best assets you made?
So if you want to write great content, you have to have an abundance of material. And what I mean by that is you have to constantly be searching out information about your domain. When people ask me, like, how can you put together a talk on like 15 minutes notice? Well, it's because I've been doing this for 25 years and I have so many stories. I have thousands of stories and anecdotes and experiences. And I save every slide deck I put together. So I have this enormous amount of past resources to work with.
Yep.
And the way to do that is just to be incredibly curious all the time. Kids these days, you grew up in a world where you can find the answer to anything, to anything at any time. Just be insatiably curious. And that will give you an abundance of media. That will give you a massive warehouse of ideas and concepts of information that you can pull things out of and put together. When I come up with a new talk, if I have to do it on the spot very, very quickly, I rarely have to come up with anything from scratch. I can piece together a talk from hundreds of talks I've done in the past.
Interesting, yeah.
And then it helps to work in a domain that you're very, very passionate about. People want to hear emotion. They want to hear passion. They want to hear personal investment. And I think especially going forward, the other big revolution in content these days is AI, right?
Yeah.
No one's going to write anything anymore. AI is going to write it for us. What we're going to end up with is a lot of really crappy content that sounds alike. And the new currency of content is going to be human connection. It's going to be content where you can hear a person behind that, and you can feel their passion and you can feel the emotion behind it. And that's going to be the currency of content. That's what's going to separate great content from everything else.
Yeah. And I really like that point as well, because like, I feel like a lot of content, like a lot of blogs right now are like being written by like ChatGPT, but if you're in content enough, if you've seen enough AI writing, like you can always tell when you land on that page, like this whole thing was written by like ChatGPT, and like it definitely like devalues that like so much compared to if a human writes it, where you can see that emotion, feel the personality within their writing.
I always feel that content is kind of a time shifted connection. Time shifting is a phrase that originated in the 1980s when VCRs came out. So VCRs came out in the 1980s, and people started recording TV shows.
Yeah,
and TV studios sued because they said this was copyright infringement to record the TV shows. And it went all the way to, I believe, the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court came up with a phrase called time shifting. The Supreme Court said that recording a TV show is really just shifting it in time. You're still watching the same show. You're just watching it at a later time.
I like that.
And so I've always looked at content as a time-shifted connection. You and I are talking right now. We're talking real-time, face-to-face.
Yeah.
Well, not face-to-face, but we're talking in real-time, synchronously. This is a real-time connection. If I were to write something and you were to read that 3 months later and get the same emotion and feeling that I'm giving to you right now, that's just a time-shifted connection. It like we had this conversation, but we just had it 3 months in the future. The connection between the creation of content and the consumption of content is really a time shift. And I've always thought that content is an amazing time machine. It allows you to reach through time and affect somebody in the future. And that's an incredible power to have.
Yeah. And I definitely like it does make you connect. And like, I really like that thread of like adding personality, like that time shift in it, and like the right. And I know from your experience, like with everything you've published, everything you've done, like having personality to create that human connection probably is like one of the biggest things for a writer in content.
I want to hear from a person.
Yeah.
I mean, it's different if it's like technical writing or documentation or instructions. Then I don't want to hear from a person. But otherwise, I want some kind of human connection behind what I consume.
I really like that. Let's give some more advice to someone that's like young in their career that wants to do content. They want to do content. They're like, I'm opportunistic about this. I'm ready to get started. What are some trends, some big opportunities that you think are in content for someone young in their career that you kind of see shaping up?
You know, the thing is, don't ask for permission. We live in a world now where you can publish anything yourself. You don't have to ask somebody for permission to do it. You can make your own name. And what really accelerated my career and got me to the position that I got to today was just I created a lot of content. I wrote a lot of things. I wasn't afraid to look dumb about something. There were times where I wrote a blog post and a year later I went back and said, wow, I was totally wrong when I wrote that last. But I think living out in the open like that and creating your content out in the open becomes this kind of story of your own growth as a professional and as a person. Don't wait for someone to ask permission. If you are involved in a profession, if you are a stonecutter and you want to write or make videos about cutting stone, nobody can stop you. We're in a world where you can do that right now. You have to be afraid. You have to not be afraid to look maybe less than perfect. Perfect is the enemy of productivity. And if you wait till things are perfect, they're never going to get done. You've just got to kind of buckle in and do it, create content. Save everything you create. Save it all, because you will revisit it later and you will remix it later. And technology trends I wrote about 20 years ago are suddenly coming back into vogue. And I can point back saying, I solved all these problems and wrote about all these things 20 years ago. And I can borrow things from that past content that I wrote and use them kind of in current presentations today. So Don't ask for permission. Don't wait for anyone to tell you can. Save everything you write. Look at the content you create as what I call a continuing, evolving body of work.
Interesting.
From the day you first put a finger on a keyboard, you are creating a body of work. And when you sit down to create new content, you're not creating new content. You're enlarging your body of work. And look at it that way. You are constantly enlarging your body of work. And that's what will define you from a content.
Yeah. And what I really like about that is like, it really is just like pressing publish whenever you do have content. If it's a blog, if it's a podcast, if it's a YouTube video, it's just pressing publish. And in a year from now, like, sure, you might go back and be like, oh, wow, I am doing things totally different. Why was I doing it that way? But that is the beauty of pressing publish and like actually seeing your work out there, is you can revisit it 20 years later, like you said, and be like, oh, like kind of would change that now, but like I see similarities and whatnot. So yeah, publish.
I have some blog posts from 22 years ago that I've added headers to. I've added disclaimers to, like in the last few years, and said, look,
yeah.
I know, like The Guardian, I think there's a website or a news website where you go to a news article and it'll have a header saying, be aware this content is 16 years old. And I've added some headers like that to content I've written in the past to say, look, I think differently now, and maybe link them to a new updated blog post. But I don't pull that down because that's part of my narrative history of being a professional.
I love that.
That's part of what I thought at the time. I've never claimed to be perfect. My professional life is a work in progress, and I'm not afraid to show, like, this was my thinking at the time. It's evolved since then.
Yeah.
And I've always felt that there's an authenticity of that that's worked well.
Yeah, I really, really like that. And if someone is like, okay, like, yes, like I'm ready to press publish, but first I need an idea of like what I want to work on. You kind of talked about just being curious and like looking up on the internet, but like, where would you advise someone to like start like from ground zero if they wanted to start creating content?
So a great way, if you know nothing about it, if you don't think you know enough about a domain of content to write something about it, come up with a question about that domain of content and document your attempt to answer that question. And don't answer it like, I knew this all along and I'm going to explain this to you. Document your experience answering this. Like, if there is some problem in your industry, research that and do a narrative document of like, this is what I did to research this question. Those are very, very interesting to read.
Yeah.
And the one thing that you will learn is creating content helps answer a lot of questions. When I start writing about something, often I'm writing about it because I don't understand it. And as I write about it, I will articulate questions. In programming, there's an apocryphal story about the rubber duck debugging. Rubber duck debugging is this programming manager, his IT manager, and he had a rubber duck on the shelf in his office. And if somebody walked in with a question, he would make them explain the question to the rubber duck. And they would have to explain this question to the rubber duck, and half the time in the process of explaining that, they would suddenly realize what they did wrong. And this is how you like answer those questions and learn those things, because you might start a document like exploring and making a narrative history of your attempt to answer a question. Yep. And then you realize by the time you get to the end, you have definitively answered that question. And then you can change the tone of the document saying, hey, this is what I learned. Don't be afraid to write a story about your own ignorance and your effort to resolve that. That is heroic in a lot of ways, and it makes for compelling content.
I really, really like that. That's a really good place to start. And I love the rubber duck concept. That's a new one for me.
I love the story. I don't know if I would have loved to stand there and talk to a rubber duck in the moment, but the story's great.
That is a great story. And I want to talk about your story a little bit more as well. So we talked to advice on just content in general, but just people that are getting into the workforce, young in their career. What advice like would you give them to like really ensure like you're making an impact right away, you're on par with what you want to do, avoid these mistakes? What's some advice you'd give to people young in their career?
So if you're graduating from college, I read a book once about getting your first job in tech. And I remember the first chapter is all about culture fit. Go for the culture. Go for the culture that matches what you want to do. And I am against this.
Oh, okay.
I'm against this. I maintain that a great culture is something that you grow into. Your number one goal for your job out of college is the job that will teach you the most. And this may be boring. You may want to go work at some internet startup with foosball tables and free beer in the fridge, but working in the dysfunctional IT department of an insurance company still running on 20-year-old mainframes, you might learn a hell of a lot more than that. What you don't understand is that what you don't understand in your 20s, which I didn't understand, is that especially if you're working in IT, Your greatest skill is not your technical skill. It's not your ability to program, not your ability to configure networks. Your greatest skill is your ability to talk to people, to understand what they need, and to bridge the gap between what they say, what they mean, and what the technology is capable of doing. IT is a human social industry. Technology is just how we get there. If you take your grandmother and you put her in a Ferrari, she's going to wreck that Ferrari because it's just a mismatch between which is capable of what technology is complicated. You can put her in the passenger seat and you drive the Ferrari and just have a fantastic time. And that's really your job. Your job is to learn to communicate with people, learn what they actually need despite what they're saying, and figure out how to bridge that gap.
Yeah, that's a lot of. We hear that advice a lot on this podcast is like find like for like a technical role, like, oh, the technical roles matter, but what will separate you apart is your personable skills. Like, can you communicate? Can you persuade people? Similar to like what you said, like your technical skills matter, but having these personal skills, these leadership skills is way more valuable for,
you can find developers. I mean, you can find people to program. Finding people to communicate is much harder. I was having dinner with a friend in Copenhagen. And we were sitting around, we had a few drinks, and we were planning out a conference. We were going to put on a conference. We never did this, but we were planning this conference. And we were thinking, who would become talk at this conference? And we thought, what do organizations really, really need? Like, they need content strategists, they need content creators, they need developers. What do they really need? And at the end of the day, and maybe we had just had one too many drinks by this point, but we came up with the idea that we should just invite a bunch of like therapists and counselors. Because the average organization needs like a counselor. And I was in consulting for many years.
Yeah.
And I was put in this situation where you would be brought in to consult on a problem, and they would set up a big meeting, and you would come in the room and you sit down at the table, and you would realize to your horror that these people had never talked about this problem before. And they were all pissed off with each other. And suddenly you were now the group therapist that were going to help us work through these issues. And there's always so much subtext to these situations. Like, Bob doesn't want to deal with this problem because he made a massive mistake 3 years ago and people will find out about it. Mary doesn't want to deal with this problem because if it's solved, she won't have a job.
Yeah.
John doesn't want to deal with this problem because it'll make Ted look good, and Ted made a pass at his wife at the company Christmas party. You run into these things constantly. These are human issues. Coming out of college, you look at professionals and you think, oh, well, they're mature, intelligent people. No, they're not. I'm 53 years old and I'm still wildly irrational about a lot of things. And no matter how mature and professional you think someone is, I promise you that they have got neurosis and irrationalities that you are going to have to deal with. And one of the most valuable things you can do, especially in technology, is learning how to deal with people, learning how to understand them.
Interesting.
Learning how to talk to them, learning how to communicate with them, because it all comes down to social problems in the end.
I'm curious. So that's something that you learned young in your career, but was there a point for you when like you felt very confident, like holding a meeting like that, where like, oh, I have to juggle all these different personalities and like communicate with all these people? Like, what stage of your career, how did you start to become more comfortable with that?
Yeah, so it was utterly terrifying.
Yeah.
The best thing to do is to have a really good mentor, to go into a job where you are forced into these situations with somebody that you can observe. So you can be like the second chair in these meetings. And if you do that enough time, it's so much easier.
Yeah.
But as a consultant, if you're going in and consulting with someone, there's always this kind of existential terror. Like, do I actually know what I'm talking about? And you just sometimes have to persuade yourself that you're the right person to be in that situation at the right time.
Yeah.
I got to a point in my career where I could safely say that I knew more than most of my clients, but I would still have to remind myself of this every time I went into a consulting engagement. I had to remind myself that I was the right guy to be in the room. There are huge amounts of what they call imposter syndrome in consulting. There are people who are terrified to be in the room, don't think they should be in the room, and they make irrational decisions and they alienate people because of it. It helps to stay humble. I wrote a blog post once called The Consultant's Dilemma. And the consultant's dilemma is when people hire a consultant, they think they're hiring us because we have the answers to everything. And that's not why you're hiring us. You're hiring a consultant because he's going to help you find the answer to something. Yeah. He's going to ask the questions. He's going to walk you down a path to help you find this answer. In an ideal consulting situation, you find the answer yourself just with the consultant's help.
Yeah.
And that can be tricky. Find a good mentor. Find a mentor in your industry of what you want to do. Second chair with that mentor. observe.
I feel like, honestly, like mentorship for me has been like one of the biggest things for my personal development, because it's like I have someone that's like 5-6 years older than me, and like he's in shoes like that I would want to be in when I'm 5 or 6 years down the road. And so, yeah, like observing him and like having him as a mentor has been huge in my career. And I also want to ask about imposter syndrome too, because I feel like that's what a lot of people young in their career deal with. How do you get over imposter syndrome? What's like your sound advice for getting over that?
Stay very, very humble. Be very careful making grand pronouncements about things. In that blog post I wrote, The Consultant's Dilemma, I told a story of where I went in somewhere and I acted like I was the smartest one in the room, and I made grand pronouncements very early in the project about what we should do. I didn't understand what the hell I was talking about. Go in. I didn't, and it was a disaster. And go in with humility and go in with ignorance. Listen very, very carefully. Be very careful about making judgment calls about anything before you know all the facts.
Interesting.
Before you've done half of your fact finding, you shouldn't be making a decision on anything, because where you end up might be completely different from where you started. But imposter syndrome is real, and everybody has it to a certain extent, and it's natural. And if you're terrified early in your career, congratulations, you're probably doing it right.
I was going to say that's probably a good thing if you're experiencing that much discomfort of being in a room with people that are so much farther ahead of you, because I feel like that's probably a good thing other than the other way around.
If you have no discomfort and no trepidation walking into this situation, I guarantee you're going to say something stupid. Yeah. You're going to paint yourself into a corner. You're going to step in it. Go in, listen more than you talk, for sure.
I love that. Well, Deane, that's going to wind us down today. You are the man. Thank you so, so much for being here today. Where can people learn more about you and connect with you?
So I have just my own personal website, deanebarker.net. Deane's got an E on the end of it, DeaneBarker.net. And then I was a very early user of LinkedIn. I was user number 1500.
Wow.
So my LinkedIn URL is LinkedIn/in/Deane, DEANE. I was user number 1500, and now there's like 700 million. So yeah, you can connect with me there. I have all my contact information on the page of my website. I'm not a hard get. So.
Awesome. And everyone, those links will be down below. Deane, thank you so, so much for being here today. Awesome to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.